All right, so we're diving into something pretty heavy today. Slavery in the Abrahamic religions. You guys sent in a ton of sources, YouTube debates, articles, historical stuff. Looks like you're ready to tackle this.
And it's definitely one to approach carefully. A lot of misconceptions out there, especially with a topic as, well, sensitive as slavery. But yeah, going through these sources together, we can hopefully get a clearer picture.
For sure. So our goal today is to break down how Judaism, Christianity, and Islam dealt with slavery, both in their texts and, throughout history. Good place to start might be setting the scene. Historically, slavery didn't start with these religions, right?
Right. Way before any of the Abrahamic faiths, slavery was already like a global thing. The Code of Hammurabi, the Roman Empire, huge slave systems, India, China, Africa. It was everywhere for centuries before these religions even came about.
So they didn't invent it, but they definitely had to figure out how to deal with it, which is where things get interesting. How did religions that focused on morality and justice, how they handle this brutal system that already existed? Let's start with the Hebrew Bible. One clear stance on slavery, or is it more complicated?
Oh, it's definitely more complicated. The Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, doesn't outright condemn slavery. It's got a whole mix of perspectives and practices showing just how complex things were back then. You see different types of slaves mentioned, each with their own rules and implications.
Different types, so it wasn't just slave or free?
Nope. You had distinctions like Hebrew slaves versus non-Hebrew slaves. Like Exodus 21.7:11 talks about female Hebrew slaves who could be sold by their fathers and maybe even face lifelong servitude.
Sold by their fathers. That's pretty shocking to think about now.
Yeah, it really shows how patriarchal that society was. Then you've got Exodus 21.2-6, which is about male Hebrew slaves. They could be enslaved for life too, but the rules for them were different from the female Hebrew slaves.
So even within Hebrew slaves, there were differences based on gender.
Exactly. And then it gets even more complex when you bring in non-Hebrew slaves. Leviticus 25.4446 is pretty clear. Israelites were allowed to buy slaves from other nations. And it wasn't just some theoretical thing. It was common. The Bible's full of stories about wars and conquests where the Israelites took slaves.
So slavery was deeply embedded in the legal and social systems of ancient Israel.
It really was. And it wasn't just people captured in wars or sold by family. The Hebrew Bible even talks about hereditary slaves, basically born into slavery, almost no chance of freedom. Generations stuck in forced labor. Pretty sobering.
Yeah. Tough to square that with, a God of goodness and all that.
It does raise some difficult questions theologically. And those questions get tougher when you consider another disturbing part of slavery in the Hebrew Bible. They allowed physical punishment.
Wait, there are passages that actually say it's okay to beat slaves.
There are. Exodus 21.20-21, for example, it outlines how to punish slaves. And it even says that, if a master beats a slave to death, they won't be punished if the slave lived for a day or two after.
So as long as they didn't die instantly, there were basically no consequences for the master?
Pretty much. Losing their property was considered punishment enough. These passages are, they're tough to read from a modern perspective, show a pretty harsh reality.
Yeah, no kidding. It definitely makes you think about the values of those ancient societies, what they actually believed. So we've got different categories of slaves, hereditary servitude being okay, and physical punishment allowed, all in the Hebrew Bible. Paints a pretty bleak picture.
It does. And this is kind of the backdrop for how later Abrahamic faiths, like Christianity, had to deal with this legacy.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about. Moving from the Hebrew Bible to the New Testament, I think a lot of people would just assume Jesus' love and compassion, all that. He would have been against slavery, right?
It's a natural assumption, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. Jesus and Paul, they did preach treating everyone kindly, but they didn't exactly say, get rid of slavery. The New Testament mostly just accepts slavery as part of life back then, fitting in with the social norms.
That's surprising. Any specific examples of how the New Testament deals with, or maybe doesn't deal with?
Sure. One thing that sticks out is how Jesus uses slaves in his parables. In Matthew 18.25, there's that story about a king forgiving a servant's debt, but then that servant turns around and doesn't forgive a smaller debt owed to him. Jesus uses this to teach about forgiveness, but he doesn't really question the whole debt bondage thing, which was basically slavery.
So slavery was so common, it was just accepted, not even seen as a problem.
Exactly. Just part of how things were. And you see this in other places too, like Acts 4.32 and 5.11. They mention slaves being part of early Christian communities. No big deal. No one objecting.
So early Christians actually owned slaves.
Yeah.
That's hard to imagine with the whole message of, equality and brotherhood.
It is. Makes you wonder how they saw Jesus' teachings, how they applied them to their own lives. Even Paul, a major figure, when he talks about slavery in his letters, he doesn't say to abolish it. He's more about how to behave within the system that's already there.
Like in Ephesians 6.58 and 1 Timothy 6.12, right?
Yeah, those are the ones. Paul tells slaves to obey their masters and masters to be fair to their slaves, respect, fairness, all that. But he doesn't say, set your slaves free.
So be good to your slaves, but slavery itself isn't the problem.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. And it's worth pointing out the New Testament doesn't totally ignore the bad parts of slavery either. There are passages that say disobedient slaves could be punished physically, even killed.
Whoa, really? Kill?
Yep. Luke 12.47, there's a slave getting beaten because he didn't do what his master said. And in Matthew 24.51, a slave is cut to pieces for doing wrong.
Man, that's rough. How did people even interpret those verses back then?
Good question, and scholars still debate that. Some say you got to see it in the context of the Roman Empire, things were brutal. Others say you got to focus on the bigger message of love and forgiveness in the New Testament.
So open to interpretation. Interesting, but also makes it tough to say anything, for sure.
True. Slavery in the New Testament, it's complex, lots of sides to it. It's something people are still trying to figure out.
Okay, so we've looked at the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Both allowed slavery in their time. Now, Islam. I know people say it's a pro-slavery religion. What do our sources say about that?
Yeah, those ideas usually come from people not understanding the history or the nuances of what Islam teaches. Got to be careful and open-minded here.
Definitely. So how does Islam approach slavery? Different from what we saw in the Bible.
It is, in a few key ways. Islam doesn't say to immediately get rid of slavery, but it presents itself as trying to make things better, less harmful, and moving towards a fairer society.
Reform, not just getting rid of it completely. What makes you say Islam was trying to reform slavery?
Well, for one, unlike the Ten Commandments, the Quran, Islam's holy book, doesn't list slavery as something God requires. It's a subtle difference, but important. Slavery isn't, ordained by God.
So a different way of looking at it from the start. Interesting.
Yeah. And the Quran also keeps saying how good it is to free slaves, that it pleases God. It encourages freeing slaves. It's aiming for a world where slavery just isn't normal anymore.
And this wasn't just talk, right? Didn't the Prophet Muhammad free slaves himself and push for treating them well?
He did. The Prophet Muhammad, he freed slaves. He married freed slaves. And he always told his followers to be kind and respectful to slaves. There's even a hadith in Sahih Bukhari, Volume 1, Book 2, number 29, where he says slaves are like brothers.
Brothers. That's way different from the whole owner and property language in the Bible.
Totally. And this idea that slaves and masters are both human, you see it in Islamic law, too. It had ways for slaves to become free, like mukataba and tadbir.
Not familiar with those. What are they?
So mukataba was basically a contract. A slave could earn their freedom by paying their master a certain amount over time. Tadbir meant a slave would be freed when their master died. These were built into Islamic law, so there were actual ways for slaves to get their freedom.
So even without abolishing slavery outright, Islam had ways to help people transition out of it towards a more just system.
Right. And this reform idea, it's really clear in how Islam sees physical punishment of slaves. The Bible, we saw, it allowed beating slaves. Islam was completely different.
How so? What does Islam say about how to treat slaves?
There's a hadith in Sahih Muslim where the Prophet Muhammad straight up forbids hitting slaves. And get this, the way to make up for hitting a slave is to set them free.
Wow, so you can't hit them, and if you do, you have to free them. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. Shows how different Islam's perspective was. Slavery existed, but Islamic teachings tried to change it from within. Treat slaves ethically, give them ways to be free, and aim for a society where everyone has dignity and respect.
Okay, so we've looked at how 3 major religions have approached this complicated issue of slavery. They each have their own history, their own teachings. Hard to make, simple judgments. But what I see is, even in systems that allowed slavery, there were people and groups pushing for more justice, more compassion.
I agree. And I think that's a big takeaway from all this. Even when something is so deeply ingrained in society, there were people who challenged it, who tried to make the world a better place.
Yeah, it's been a lot. And it's easy to think, well, that was back then, right? Slavery's over. But not quite that simple, is it?
Nope, not at all. Thinking slavery's just history, that's a mistake. It didn't really disappear. Just changed, got sneakier, harder to see. Human trafficking, forced labor, all that, still a huge problem.
Like it went underground, harder to spot, harder to fight.
That's a good way to put it. And the numbers are crazy. The International Labor Organization, they think over 40 million people are stuck in modern slavery today. More than any other time in history. It's a global crisis.
40 million. Man, that's hard to even imagine. So, like, how do we connect all this history with what's happening now?
Yeah.
What can we learn from the past to help us fight slavery today?
One thing's for sure, slavery thrives when it's hidden. These systems are complicated, hard to understand, hard to hold anyone accountable. That's why knowing about it, being aware, is so important. The more we understand how modern slavery works, the better we can spot it, call it out, and work to stop it.
So, yeah, the more you know, the more you can do, right?
Right, and that's where groups like Free the Slaves come in. They're doing the hard work, rescuing people, supporting them, and pushing for policies that get to the root of the problem.
Their website, www.freetheslaves.net, it's a great place to start if you want to learn more or help out. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, though, you know? Like, what can one person do against something this big?
A lot of people feel that way. It's natural. But everyone can do something. Start with learning about it, being careful about what you buy, supporting those organizations fighting slavery, and speaking up when you see injustice. Even small things, millions of people doing them, it adds up.
I like that. We all have a part to play. Even small choices can make a difference.
For sure. And it's about shifting how we think. Instead of, what can I do? Ask, what am I already doing? Even without realizing it, that might be part of the problem. Are we supporting companies that mistreat workers? Ignoring exploitation in our own communities? Tough questions, but we gotta ask them if we really want to be part of the solution.
So, like, taking a deep dive into our own lives, looking at what we do every day, making sure it lines up with what we believe in, that's a good point to end on, I think. It's not just about blaming others. It's about looking at ourselves. What are we doing to keep these systems going or to tear them down?
Well put. And I hope everyone listening comes away from this not just knowing more, but feeling like they can do something. Because fighting for a world without slavery, any kind of slavery, that's a fight worth having.